What was the Vietnam War? The Vietnam War was the prolonged struggle between nationalist forces attempting to unify the country of Vietnam under a communist government and the United States, with the aid of the South Vietnamese, attempting to prevent the spread of communism. Engaged in a war that many view as having no way to win, US leaders lost the American public support for the war. Since the end of the war, the Vietnam War has become a benchmark for what not to do in all future US foreign conflicts. Dates of the Vietnam War: 1955 to 1975. It is also known as the American War in Vietnam, Vietnam Conflict, Second Indochina War, and the War against the Americans to save the nation. Between 1945 and 1954, the Vietnamese waged an anti-colonial war against France, which received $2.6 billion in financial support from the United States. The French defeat at the Dien Bien Phu was followed by a peace conference in Geneva. As a result of the conference, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam received their independence, and Vietnam was temporarily divided between an anti-communist South and a communist North. In 1956, South Vietnam, with American backing, refused to hold unification elections. By 1958, communist-led guerrillas known as the Viet Cong had begun to battle the South Vietnamese government. To support the South's government, the United States sent in 2,000 military advisors, a number that grew to 16,300 in 1963. The military condition deteriorated, and by 1963, South Vietnam had lost the fertile Mekong Delta to the Viet Cong. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson escalated the war, commencing airstrikes on the North Vietnam and committing ground forces, which numbered 536,000 in 1968. The 1968 Tet Offensive by the North Vietnamese turned many Americans against the war. The next president, Richard Nixon, advocated Vietnamization, withdrawing American troops and giving South Vietnam greater responsibility for fighting the war. In 1970, Nixon attempted to slow the flow of North Vietnamese soldiers and supplies into South Vietnam by sending American forces to destroy communist supply bases in Cambodia. This act violated Cambodian neutrality and provoked anti-war protests on the nation's college campuses. From 1968 to 1973, efforts were made to end the conflict through diplomacy. In January 1973, an agreement was reached. US forces were withdrawn from Vietnam, and US prisoners of war were released. In April 1975, South Vietnam surrendered to the North, and Vietnam was reunited. Extra information. According to a survey by the Veterans Administration, some 500,000 of the 3 million troops who served in Vietnam suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and rates of divorce, suicide, alcoholism, and drug addiction were markedly higher among veterans.